thank you all so much for coming tonight. I'm glad that you could join us. I want to also welcome my esteemed panelists. I'm Kate Lipper-Garabedian, the state representative for the 32nd Middlesex District, which includes Melrose, Wakefield, and Malden. I'm glad to be your host and moderator for a timely conversation tonight on a topic of personal and significant professional interest. In elevating this virtual environment, we're bringing together diverse people in diverse spaces. I want to especially acknowledge those joining from my district, as well as those from across the Commonwealth. So officially welcome to my 9th Community Conversation program. Tonight's theme, the right to privacy in a digital age. I'm glad to be joined by a panel of experts to discuss issues of data privacy, confidentiality, and security in our modern, technologically driven world. We'll explore efforts at the federal and state level to update our legal frameworks, which have been vastly outpaced by the technological advancements, and we'll consider options available to companies and consumers to separately take action in this space. With that, let's review our time together. After I introduce our panelists, we'll hear from Senator Ed Markey on his leadership to pass legislation related to children and data privacy. I'll then set the context for our discussion before turning to the panel for remarks and dialogue. So again, I'm so elated to host an accomplished group of panelists tonight. Cade Crockford is the director of the Technology for Liberty program at the ACLU of Massachusetts. Cade works to protect and expand core First and Fourth Amendment rights and civil liberties in the digital 21st century, focusing on how systems of surveillance and control impact not just our society in general, but primary targets, people of color, Muslims, immigrants, and dissidents. I've been glad to consult with Cade and her colleagues on my bill, the Student and Educator Data Privacy Act, which we'll discuss shortly. Sarah Cluck is the Vice President of Education and Children's Policy at the Software and Information Industry Association. She focuses on a broad range of issues, including education technology policy and children's privacy issues. Sarah previously served as the Senior Privacy and Technology Fellow at the U.S. Department of Education in the Office of the Chief Privacy Officer, and as an education policy advisor to a senior member of the U.S. House of Representatives. Sarah, on behalf of the SIIA, engaged with the Massachusetts Education Committee this session on my bill. Anna Linhart is the Senior Legislative Assistant for Massachusetts Congresswoman Lori Trahan. Anna is committed to the equitable development and implementation of technological systems. She was a senior consultant and the AI Ethics Initiative lead for IBM's Federal Government Consulting Division. She has researched the human right to freedom from discrimination in algorithms, public views on autonomous vehicles, and AI's impact on the workforce. I've been pleased to collaborate with Anna and Rep. Trahan's office on federal and state efforts to update statutes in this space. And Klaus von Zastro is the Senior Policy Director at the Education Commission of the States. He oversees efforts to improve statewide longitudinal data systems. He has held senior positions in education policy and research for more than 17 years, working with diverse stakeholders to find consensus on important education issues. This July, I was pleased to join ECS at a 2-day data privacy thinkers roundtable, which Klaus facilitated to inform a forthcoming ECS publication. Tonight, I'm honored to turn, and I'm turning now to Senator Ed Markey. I'm very grateful for his contribution to tonight's program. Senator Markey has represented the Commonwealth in Congress for more than 4 decades, first as a member of the House and now as a senator since 2013. Senator Markey has been a leader in many policy areas, including digital privacy. In 1998, Congress enacted the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, a bill that the senator authored. In the decades since, he has led on efforts to update that law and modernize the nation's internet privacy rules. I'm glad to raise up his voice now on the efforts of Congress and the Federal Trade Commission to enhance online protections for children.
Hello, and thank you for including me in today's community conversation on digital privacy. Thank you to Representative Kate Lipper-Garabedian for hosting this event. Thanks for your great work. You are just such a great leader. Protecting kids online has been a priority of mine. In 1998, Congress enacted the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which I authored. That law is still the constitution of children's privacy in our country. But so much has changed from 1998. In 1998, only birds tweeted. And that's not today. Our federal policy needs to keep pace with all of these technological changes, because today, too many online platforms have an insatiable appetite for young people's data and young people's attention. Too many online platforms operate with business models that hook consumers when they are young. Too many online platforms amass troves of kids' personal information to power black box algorithms that amplify toxic content, harming users' mental well-being every single day. So thankfully, Congress is now closer than ever to addressing these threats. Legislation is pending. In July, the Senate Commerce Committee, which I sit on, took an historic step by passing my Children and Teens Online Privacy Protection Act. My bill would accomplish a lot of necessary things. It would ban targeted advertising to children. No more targeting kids. It would stop websites from collecting data from users who are 13 to 16 years old without their consent. We have that as a rule for under 13. We have to move it up to 16. And establish a digital marketing bill of rights for teens to limit collection of their data. Close the loophole that allows social media sites to bury their heads in the sand and pretend kids aren't on their platforms. And create an eraser button by requiring companies to permit users to eliminate information from a child or from a teen. When the Senate Commerce Committee advanced my bill this summer, we sent a message to big tech. The failed era of self-regulation is coming to an end. After all, the COVID pandemic just highlighted the importance of the internet for young people. It's almost like oxygen for young people. And it's highlighted the benefits of educational technologies in particular, but children's education should never come at the expense of her privacy. We just have to be smarter about the impact that the internet is having. And that's why in May of 2020, I led my colleagues in calling upon the Federal Trade Commission to launch an investigation into children's data practices in the educational technology sector. And I was pleased that earlier this year, the Federal Trade Commission released a policy statement outlining the agency's commitment to enforcing my law, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, to protect kids under 13's privacy when they use educational technology platforms. But there's just so much more work to be done, but I'm optimistic that this is our moment. Parents, pediatricians, policymakers, they all know that the threats to kids' privacy online has reached a crisis point, and inaction is no longer an option. In his State of the Union address, President Biden told Congress and the country that we need to stop big tech's predatory practices that threaten kids' privacy and well-being online every single day. Well, I'm laser focused on getting that done. And I thank all of you for all the attention that you are paying to this pressing problem. This is truly a crisis in our country, and you are doing God's work here on earth to protect the young people in our country. Thank you so much for everything that you are doing.
Great. So as the senator said, we live in a digital world. The vast majority of people today, albeit not my father, carry cell phones. Millions use computers for work and leisure, and we engage in online commerce, whether that's shopping at home or even physically in stores at point of sale moments. Advancements in digital technology have resulted in tremendous opportunities. For example, in the delivery of healthcare and improved health outcomes, and the establishment of successful safety protocols, and a more seamless approach to peer-to-peer inclusive finance and streamlined commercial functions, and in student learning. As many of you know, I'm a former teacher. I'm now a parent as well, and I've seen the potential for education technology to enhance the classroom experience and complement curricula in ways that engage and inspire students, leading to learning breakthroughs and supporting personalized learning. These opportunities and benefits are made possible only through the sharing of personal information and the pursuit of such outcomes. And with that arise the concerns highlighted by Senator Markey in his remarks. In preparing for this program, I actually was reminded of a publication on which I was a primary author back in 2015 on Another Life. At that point in time, I wrote, quote, "We share certain personal data whenever we sign up for a business rewards program, join a local gym, or subscribe to paid and unpaid online services. For many years, we have intuitively considered access to our personal information as a reasonable trade-off for the promises of convenience, for financial savings, and other perceived incentives. But as the data collection and sharing revolution has evolved, driven particularly by the increased digitalization of our personal information, the public increasingly has become aware that bad actors like hackers can easily victimize and exploit the growing public and commercial data repositories of personal information. And use of personal data has raised questions about the lengths to which corporations, governments, and private individuals will go to access information for their own interests. These concerns are not misplaced. In the intervening years since that paper, we've witnessed congressional hearings on social media algorithms that exacerbate discord and dissemination of false information. We've received research on the discriminatory nature of facial recognition technology. We've read about a multi-billion-dollar industry dedicated to selling and trading our personal data. And many of us have probably received a number of disclosures about security breaches that may have included our data. So it's a matter of responsive governance then that we see Congress and state legislatures across the country working to address how online companies handle users' content. This push comes from both sides of the aisle. State legislators filed over 100 bills in the past year related to digital privacy. Just last week, California's governor signed into law a bill protecting children's online data. In Massachusetts this session, House and Senate leadership reflected on that growing recognition of the importance of a legal framework for the digital space by creating a joint committee on the advanced IT, the internet, and cybersecurity, with many relevant bills considered there, including some displayed on this slide. I'd like to just take a moment to talk about two of them. So one is my priority bill this session, on which I'm a lead sponsor and author, the Student and Educator Data Privacy Act. Drawing on the efforts of 45 states that already have updated their laws in the last decade in this space, this bill requires that education technology service providers adhere to critical security practices and prohibits them from commercializing student and educator data they receive via their services to an educational entity. The bill identifies provisions necessary for agreements between these third-party contractors and the educational entities, including terms of data ownership and access, security brief notifications, and data destruction. The bill would enable individuals and schools to bring civil action for noncompliance and empower the Commissioner of Elementary and Secondary Education to bar an operator that fails to comply with protocols. The bill further supports districts and schools by creating a chief privacy officer at the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. That person would develop and provide model agreements, guidance, and technical assistance across the state. Additionally, it ensures that school districts prioritize student and educator data privacy by designating individuals as data managers. Altogether, it fosters greater trust in our community. I'm pleased that the bill received a favorable review from the Education Committee, which blessed it in full, and I would love to see continued momentum before the end of the session. If we don't get there, I'm committed to refiling it next year. Another bill to raise up is the Massachusetts Information Privacy Act. Likewise, it received a favorable review, this time from the Advanced IT Committee, before it was sent to study. This bill would establish a data accountability and transparency agency to protect and enforce individuals' privacy rights with respect to the collection, use, and sharing of personal data. Technology companies would need to provide meaningful notice and opt-in consent requirements for users' data sharing. Certain data practices, including the selling and trading of information, would be banned absent consent. I anticipate the legislature will reconsider this bill in the coming session. With that, I'm thrilled now to turn to our expert panelists to hear from each of you about the work you're doing in this space. We're going to start with Anna. Really glad that you could be here today to talk with us a bit about efforts in Congress to update the federal law framework regarding digital privacy and some of the recent efforts of the Federal Trade Commission. So thanks very much, and please take it away.
Thank you so much. So first, I am the tech policy advisor for Congresswoman Trahan, who represents Massachusetts 3rd, so the Merrimack Valley, but great to be with you all today. The Congresswoman sits on the Energy and Commerce Consumer Protection Subcommittee, and over the last year and a half or so, she's put forward proposals related to child and student privacy, terms of service readability, data brokers, and social media transparency. But most recently, the Congresswoman, under the leadership of the Energy Energy and Commerce Committee, both sides of the aisle, has been working on the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, which I will call ADAPA. The bill is a comprehensive consumer privacy bill and centers around two principles. So the first is data minimization, and the second is duty of loyalty. Data minimization really means, look, companies, digital services should only collect the data they need to provide the service that they claim to provide. It's kind of seems sort of obvious when you say it, but that's really the straightforward principle. And then duty of loyalty is once you have that data, you need to protect it. You need to securely store it. And then also you should not be selling it willy-nilly to data brokers and things of that nature, which the bill is very, very strong about. So it's a historic bill in the fact that it's the first bipartisan proposal that would include civil rights protections, so algorithmic impact assessments and mandates around ensuring that data processes do not discriminate. It is a bipartisan bill. It does have some areas of compromise. The first is that it is structured as a national framework, which means that states would not be able to go write their own comprehensive data privacy frameworks, but would be able to enforce ADAPA and the provisions in ADAPA. Additionally, states can pass their own laws on sort of narrower provisions of data protection, so student privacy, facial recognition, health data, and there's a pretty long list. And so that was a set of compromises. The bill also includes a private right of action for most provisions within the bill. And this is notable because most state laws right now do not include private rights of action. So to get that for everyone in the country is a pretty big accomplishment. ADAPA has passed out of committee in the House. And we are unsure of next steps in this Congress. Meanwhile, in the Senate, as Senator Markey explained, his bill, along with Senator Cassidy's bill, the Children and Teens Online Privacy Protection Act, has passed out of the Commerce Committee. And I won't go into it since the Senator already explained, but that is kind of the bipartisan bill that's moving over there at the moment. But I do want to talk a little bit about the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC. So while Congress has been moving and similar to what the representative was just saying, you never know what's going to make it through in the session and what's going to have to wait till next session. So the FTC has issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, an ANPR. And it is worth sort of understanding that the ANPR is actually the first step in what is kind of a windy, long rulemaking process called MAGMOS. And this is different than the traditional Administrative Procedure Act, APA rulemaking, which is what EPA and sort of other agencies use that has fewer steps. So the FTC will need to review all the public comments that it's receiving right now. And then it'll need to decide to pursue regulations, and it'll need to notify Congress before it does that. And then there will be hearings and additional procedural topics and steps. So it is a big undertaking, but in the name of protecting consumers, it's a good step. The topics that they are covering and asking questions about right now as we speak are really around just identifying and quantifying harms to consumers, specifically children and teen, but consumers at large. They are asking specific questions around automated decision-making systems, discrimination based on protected categories. They are asking about consumer consent, notice, transparency, and disclosures, things of that nature, and then also getting perspectives on remedies for violations. So the deadline for comments is October 21st, and I always want to emphasize that consumers are stakeholders, so you should certainly feel emboldened to submit comments. I promise you almost every company under the sun in this country is going to, so you certainly should as well, and you should reach out to our office if you need a little bit more direction on that.
Thanks so much, Anna. Yes, I've been so appreciative of the Congresswoman's leadership in this space, hitting the ground running, and with her committee assignment, she's in a wonderful spot to really lead on this issue. So Massachusetts is lucky to have her representing us and Senator Markey in the other chamber. So maybe we'll take it now to the state, a view of the states and what's happening specifically in the education policy world. And Klaus, I'd love to hear from you a little bit about regulatory efforts and options that you've seen states exploring when it comes to student data. And so I'll let you take it over now.
Of course, thanks very much. It's an honor to speak about this. And I should just note right now that my slides aren't really all that necessary because I noticed that you had to switch back out of speaker view. So if you want to switch back into speaker view, that's really fine. Um, uh, the state level is really an interesting picture. I should also note that I'm taking a slightly different angle at this because I'm going to talk a lot about what it is that actual state agencies should do to protect privacy of student data that they control, in addition to student data then that vendors and other kind of actors in this ecosystem would have would be handling. And so in doing so, as Representative Lipper-Garabedian mentioned, we brought together some experts and state leaders like the representative to figure out what some big principles should be for state leaders to embrace so that they can ensure that they're really protecting student data privacy at the same time that they are not in any way sort of kneecapping the power of these kinds of data systems to inform really good decision making for parents and families and educators and policymakers and others. So this really fits in with what I do at Education Commission of the States, because Education Commission of the States as a national nonpartisan nonprofit actually is focused on helping education leaders make effective education policy. And so, we work with governors and their staff, state legislators, leaders of state education agencies, state board members, et cetera, in order to help them understand and learn from each other how best to make education policy. And many of these people who are, passionate leaders and committed leaders might not actually be experts in these issues. And so what we sought to do was to figure out what some really broad principles for protecting student data privacy should be that state leaders should have to embrace so that they can be most effective in protecting student privacy. And so we came up with 5 principles. The first of these principles was really a vision. And so it was a very strong feeling among the people in that room that without a unifying vision for what data are really good for, what they are meant to do, privacy protections, may seem ad hoc, arbitrary, duplicative, sometimes aimless. And we've seen that in a number of places where it's not at all clear what the data are even for. And this gets to the point that you just heard about data minimization. Part of this is what kinds of data don't you need, right? What really does a state have to collect in order to serve its legislative mandates, right? So it has mandated to provide certain kinds of data, but also to serve students and others in the system well, and anything else. What it doesn't need to collect, it shouldn't collect. A second principle that we talked about was convenient legislation, coherent laws. And there was a strong feeling in the room that sometimes state laws can be duplicative or even contradictory, and that sometimes state laws can have unintended consequences. For example, there have been state laws that focus on things like fingerprint readers and things like that, that then would ban practically every device in the classroom. So you have to think carefully and do your due diligence to figure out what effect your state laws will actually have, but then critically ensure that there's really effective implementation and that you renew laws where necessary. Another principle was governance structures. State agencies need very strong governance and structures that really define what it is the roles and responsibilities of people in that state agency really are. And it's especially important now with multiple agencies sharing data with each other. And so state agencies sometimes can have governance structures in name only, but without any training for people to understand their roles and responsibilities, without any kinds of procedures in place to define exactly how you share data, when data are to be destroyed, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a very important element of this work for data governance and data privacy. A fourth principle was training. The reality is that you have a lot of people in an education system who handle student data from the state level all the way down to the individual school level, even the classroom level. And very often those people who have the best of intentions do not have the training to understand what sorts of things they should or should not do. And that makes them vulnerable to attacks, to mistakes, to disclosures they didn't intend. So it's very, very important in states like Utah, for example, where there is training for many people throughout the system to ensure that they're much better supported to avoid these kinds of disclosures. And finally, there's transparency. And that means that state agencies and other actors in the state should actually share what their policies even are, but show what data you're collecting, make it clear what data you aren't collecting, and make it clear what you do with those data. That ultimately supports this vision. And so that's just a summary of the big, broad principles. You can go much deeper in any one of them, but I thought I would start there.
Thanks, Klaus. That's really helpful. And as someone who's been looking into all of the ways in which states are maybe a little farther ahead of Massachusetts in terms of updating our laws in this space, I was aware of the Utah example and the training component to teacher certification. And I thought, oh, that's another bill maybe that I'll file in the next session. So let's turn now to Kate from Massachusetts ACLU. I'd love to have your reflections on some of the state and federal law efforts that we're talking about tonight, as somebody who's working to inform lawmakers as well as influence us. What are some promising practices you're seeing? What are your concerns in this space? Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Rep. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kate Crockford. I run the Technology and Civil Rights program at the ACLU of Massachusetts. We've been watching very closely what's been going on in Congress. Rep, when you opened up this event at the beginning, you put on the screen 6 bills that the Massachusetts State Legislature considered last session on issues related to data privacy on the consumer side. And then we heard from our representative in Congress's staffer about the efforts that we're seeing in Washington, D.C. to pursue consumer privacy legislation. It's really crucial that people understand the relationship between what is happening in Congress, what could possibly happen in Congress, and what we are even capable of proposing in Massachusetts. And that is a word that I haven't heard mentioned tonight, but really is at the crux of a lot of this. It's the question of preemption. So this is a legal doctrine, basically, that says, if the federal government decides that it wants to own the terrain on a certain issue, it can pass a law that prohibits state governments from passing laws that touch on that same issue. And this is a subject that creates a lot of consternation and, frankly, disagreement between the advocates who are pushing for strong civil rights and consumer privacy protections with strong enforcement. We love the private right of action, for example, and big tech, which maybe above all else actually prioritizes preemption in Congress, because what they would like to do is make it impossible for state governments to act in this space. That is something that concerns us on the consumer privacy and advocacy side very deeply, and I'll explain why. So first off, technology changes very rapidly, as we all know, and we think it would be a terrible idea for Congress to pass a law that creates what is called ceiling preemption. So that means states can't pass laws that are more privacy protective in the area of consumer privacy than Congress has done, in part because we don't even know what technologies these companies and other companies that haven't even been invented yet are going to be using in a week, in a year, in 10 years. We also know that Congress moves pretty slowly. Rep, you mentioned that Massachusetts has fallen behind here. Shame on us, and you and I are trying to fix that, and many other people here. But Congress is even farther behind on many of these issues than states, including Massachusetts. So we certainly wouldn't want to walk ourselves into a corner where we have to wait for the oftentimes, decades-long process of lawmaking in DC to address shortcomings that we discover a couple years from now exist in whatever law Congress passes. The companies also say that we can't have what we would prefer, which is floor preemption, which is to say Congress would pass a law that says all states need to have privacy protections that are this high. But if states want to go beyond that and impose stronger privacy protections, they can do so. So big tech says that that's a bad idea because they need to have simply, clear rules of the road. They need to be able to operate in the same way in California that they do in Texas, that they do in Massachusetts. But we all know, because we've used consumer products that say things about California on them, that in fact, companies are very able, do this all the time, to comply with state laws that are the most protective. That's why when we buy, lotion, we see on the label something about California environmental laws that says, this does or does not comply with, whatever the law is in California, or this has, carcinogens in it. California's law is what requires those labels to be added, but companies aren't producing different labels for all 50 states, right? We all benefit from that superior protection, and that would work in the tech industry and consumer privacy space as well. Another issue is that, states need to be, as I said before, they need to be able to innovate on behalf of technology users, on behalf of we the people. And we've seen that states really are the engine of innovation when it comes to, new technologies, when it comes, frankly, to, progressive policy on a lot of issues across the country. So that issue, it's actually what I think is leading to the talks in Congress falling apart around this bill. It creates a lot of frustration and acrimony among people who are working on these issues. But I think that's because it's really centrally important. So I would just say, if folks are interested in consumer privacy issues, give your federal representative a call and let them know that you don't want Congress to pass legislation that restricts the ability of Massachusetts or other states to pass strong privacy law down the road. So I think I'll leave it at that. And, I'll probably have plenty of other things to say as a part of the conversation. Thanks for having me.
Of course, thank you. And you've intuited one of the questions when we open it up, sort of around, well, twofold really, but one certainly is around this dynamic of the state and the federal policy making the interplay of that, and also, the acknowledgement that, generally legislative processes move slow. So, with that, how do we sort of address that reality? So I'd love to turn it over now to Sarah from SIAA. I'd love to hear from you a little bit, from the industry perspective in terms of, what are some of the values that we've talked about in terms of digital technology, and then where's their leadership within the industry around privacy and security? Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, and hi everyone. Happy evening to those that are joining us live. My name is Sarah Cluck, and I'm the Vice President of Education and Children's Policy at SIA. We're a trade association for the tech and information industry. We represent small, medium, and large-sized companies. So some of our large companies are very large, and some of our small companies are very small, 1 or 2 people that are, I know Kate went into complying with a lot of laws and referenced big tech, but the small tech companies are working to comply with these laws too. So figuring out all of the laws across the country is really hard for some of these smaller companies. So appreciate the work that's being done in Massachusetts. We really appreciate the work that the leadership in Massachusetts is doing, especially Representative Trahan and Senator Markey. They've been leaders on this issue, and I think that they're approaching a lot of the issues with a lot of stakeholders in mind. So I really appreciate that work. But I want to take it back to education because that's my background and work, and talk a little bit about that. And want to mention the federal student privacy law. I know we talked about preemption. The federal student privacy law is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. That was one of the very first privacy laws passed in the country. It was passed in the 70s. And that law is not preemptive. That is the floor for privacy protections in the US. And we have seen states adopt various student privacy laws across the country. It is hard to comply with, but that's the reality of the beast. And our companies are working to comply with each law. The interesting thing is there's no strongest state student privacy law. So there's no 1 to 2.2. Each one has little things that make it strong. So we can say this state has an interesting thing on security. This one has an interesting thing on funding. I know there was a mention of Utah. Utah funds some training. There's some funding that comes with the law, which is amazing. We really like when there's funding for state government work on student privacy. We at SIA and our member companies are not ignorant to the privacy concerns and have been working to hear what advocates are saying, what representatives are saying, and what parents are saying. We worked and launched the Student Privacy Pledge with the Future of Privacy Forum in 2014, which is a public statement for vendors to sign, stating that they will subscribe to a set of practices. We also, Senator Markey mentioned the FTC policy statement on COPPA. This is a very funny DC thing to say, but we did release a statement applauding the Federal Trade Commission for their work on that. We thought that was an important step for them to take. One thing I do want to talk a little bit about with regards to ed tech and technology that is educational. I think there are two different groupings with a gray area in between. But I look at ed tech as educational technology are products that have a contract with a school district. And those are products that are working on behalf of a school district and need to protect the student data according to student data privacy laws, FERPA being one, or state student privacy laws in California, it's called HIPAA. And then the other bucket that I look at is education or technology that is educational. And that is products that I, as a parent or a student, might be able to access at home without a contract. And that is not necessary. That data is not necessarily protected by FERPA, but is protected by children's privacy laws. So we have at the federal level, COPPA, and there was an earlier mention of the Age Appropriate Design Code and other state laws protecting children's privacy on those platforms. So I think it's an interesting distinction to make. There's definitely a gray area where there are things that there may not be a contract because a teacher is trying to figure out how to help a student that's struggling with a math subject and find something really cool to help the student and wants the student to use it. There may not be a contract that establishes the data protection regime. The teacher is really well-intentioned, but doesn't have the training, doesn't have the time to have the training and bring something in, and it isn't exactly what the intent. There aren't the exact intended privacy protections that need to happen there, but that's a really hard area to legislate. There's been some laws that have been introduced that would have sent teachers to jail, which is not what we want. Teachers are important. So figuring out how to make sure the privacy protections are there for students and also workable and implementable for companies, I think is really important to make sure that that everyone's on the same page and everyone knows what to expect. And I'm happy to talk more about this, but there's some really interesting conversations that I want to have with the rest of the people on the panel.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for teeing that up. I think that's exactly right. I'm really grateful for all of you to provide some framing remarks sort of about your perspective, what you've been working on, and then the interplay among us, I think, will be of real interest. So why don't we turn now to some of the guiding questions that we discussed, as a group that could sort of help frame a dialogue across us. I'll put them up really quickly for people who are watching now or later to sort of observe, and we'll try to work our way through them in the next 20 minutes that we have together. The first two sort of go hand in hand. It's the two sides of the coin. We've talked a little bit about digital technology and how, it's here to stay. It does so many great things and benefits us as a society in terms of health outcomes, educational outcomes, convenience factors. Obviously during a pandemic, we needed to be navigating a digital space and able to continue to function in many ways. So thinking about sort of what's on the horizon in terms of some near-term and longer-term opportunities for digital technology to really support individuals and American society. And at the same time, we're sort of talking currently about some of our concerns in this space, the bad actors, the things that are sort of in a legislative gray space. So there's no real clear sense of accountability there. And that's just what we know. But I think maybe, Kate, you referenced how quickly technology advances. So there may be things that are not even on my radar yet, and maybe some of our viewers, as well, in terms of what are some impacts coming down the road for us in terms of our right to privacy. I'd also like to make a little space to talk about international models. I mean, at a very basic level, I'm generally aware that Europe has moved maybe more quickly in this space than we have in here, but there may be other examples across the globe that we might want to raise up and think about how those examples could inform policymaking here in the United States. I'd love to go back to that question about the right interplay among federal and state policymaking. Where can states lead? Where do states need to lead? Where is it important to have sort of a consistent framework and a voice sort of centrally to demonstrate the heft and importance of this topic? And then finally, recognizing that legislative processes and regulatory, as Anna held up tonight about the FTC's process for rulemaking, move slowly and deliberatively. What are steps consumers can be taking right now to protect personal information and their right to privacy? And I'm also thinking, particularly given some of the comments tonight, how can parents be thinking about their children's right to privacy? And then what are responsible and how can responsible technology providers, like many of the ones you represent, Sarah, sort of lead in this space as well? So maybe let's start with the first two questions to sort of go hand in hand, things that we maybe touched on briefly tonight, but you'd like to just elevate once more or dive a little deeper into in terms of opportunities for digital technology to really advance some of our communal and collective goals. I'm also thinking, for example, about our climate crisis and ways that technological advancement may make a real difference there. But what are some of the real concerns that we have only recently begun to really unpack, and maybe we haven't even really surfaced yet tonight? So if we can close out the shared slide and go back so we can all see each other a little bit better. And anyone who wants to take it away, feel free. That's a lot to take on. Kate, I see you coming off mute.
Sure, yeah, I'll jump in. Like you, Rep, I'm really hopeful about green energy technologies. I just had heat pumps and solar installed at my house and an induction stove. So feeling really good about going electric. And, very excited about the possibility that, if we invested in it and decided that we wanted to prioritize it as a society, we could really transition quite quickly away from fossil fuels. So that's super exciting. Something that's really concerning to me is the fact that, abortion has been criminalized in 50 states in this country. And we know already, because we've seen miscarriage and, pregnancy loss be criminalized, particularly for low income and women of color, even prior to the Dobbs decision, that police and prosecutors who are investigating and prosecuting cases against people who have had abortions or miscarriages are going to be using a lot of the data that we leave behind us, even if it's something as simple as text messages. This has already happened in a bunch of cases in this country, including in the post-Dobbs world that we now live in. So, I think all of that is frankly a wake-up call for people who maybe have used technologies, cell phones, the internet, personal computers. We now have computers in our cars that track us everywhere we go and report back to our car manufacturers about where we're driving and where we parked our cars, including at an abortion clinic or a healthcare facility. People have become accustomed to living in this world. Our law has really failed to keep up. And for a long time, I know this because I've been doing this work for a long time. People have asked, well, why should I care about my privacy? I'm not doing anything wrong. I don't really care if Google wants to chase me around the internet with a pair of shoes that I looked at on overstock.com or whatever. We now know for many, many people, for half the population, for people who can be pregnant, and in half the states, people who can't access the abortion care that they need. This is a really clear example for people of why privacy matters and why digital privacy matters. So I think that's both really frightening, and it makes me hopeful about our ability to get some of this stuff right quickly. You know, we're going to be looking to the Massachusetts legislature next session to try to get some of these problems addressed in our state. You know, we can't control what Texas does, obviously, but we want to make sure that if someone comes to Massachusetts seeking healthcare, that it's not possible for, you know, a prosecutor in Texas to buy their cell phone location information from a data broker, for example, to use in court to prosecute a case against them, you know, a homicide case or something like that. So, you know, it's both a really frightening time, but it's also, I think, a moment of real opportunity for us to take the anger and the frustration and the fear that we see in ourselves and in our communities and in this country, and, you know, fix some of the problems with data privacy and surveillance that have gone long unaddressed, unfortunately.
Thanks, Kate. Your example of the car is a good one as well, because that computer in your car also has real benefit. That data that it's collecting can, and to your point, and be used for recalls or for identifying a safety concern. So again, it's that question of what are we collecting it for? Who can access it? Because in theory, we should be able to inherently take value in that at a consumer level. Yet we know that the data is used for can be used for many other purposes that are not nearly as advantageous or supporting our own well-being. Anyone else want to go ahead, Sarah?
Sure. I think from my perspective, and this is a more personal perspective, but on the opportunity side, I think it's really cool that kids today, no matter where they are in the country, provided they have internet access, and that's something that Senator Markey has been leading on, provided the kids have internet access, they are able to access information that information. They can go to museums, they can see all sorts of cool stuff in the world, no matter where they are. And that didn't happen while I was in school. I grew up in a relatively rural area. My husband grew up in Boston. So it's his experience growing up and his access to education was very different than my own. And I think we can see how kids are able to learn and engage with their education a lot more than they were able to even 20 years ago. And that's really cool. It's really cool to see kids be able to take ownership over their education. I think concerns that are on my radar. What Kate was saying with people engaging on certain issues because of the big issues that are happening today that are bringing to light privacy concerns. I hope that engagement stays up and people are interested in learning about what is going on. And I hope that encourages I'm hopeful that it encourages companies to be more transparent about their data practices. So citizens are able to choose companies that choose to use and engage with companies, and also not engage with companies that they don't feel comfortable with. I already see people in my space choosing to engage with certain companies, certain organizations, and others that they feel comfortable with, or not choosing, or flying to certain states that they like and certain states that maybe they're a little bit afraid to fly to. Like I hope that consumer engagement stays there. I think that's important. But I am worried that engagement will go away. But I think that's the long term. That's my political background. I always worry about people not paying attention. Yeah.
Right. No, it's a good point. And I think it does go to one of the later questions around, I think we all on this call agree that, you know, legislative framework is really critical, and being responsive and updating over time based on changing circumstances. And at the same time, there is a role that companies themselves can play in sort of that competitive economy of being able to hold out that I'm a better actor than this one. And so that gives you an advantage, and informed consumers can make choices based on that. And so that's also something, to your point, Sarah, that we should continue to really press on in our individual spaces and in our own, local communities. Maybe we'll turn to the international models, and any just quick impressions of other countries and what they've done so far in the space of digital privacy? Anything that we would want to consider either at a state level or congressionally?
I'm happy to highlight a few things that we've been looking at. A lot of people in the policy privacy advocacy space have been pushing for data minimization and duty of loyalty for a long time. And I think they've really become very salient in part because of some of the e-directives and various things we've seen that have led to a lot of pop-ups. I think people are realizing that, okay, asking for consent a lot, even if you can get rid of dark patterns and things, consumers just don't love it. And it's probably not the most effective. And I think that's actually made a really strong case for duty of loyalty and just sort of mandating that companies have to treat the data the way a consumer would expect them to do so. So I think we've, learned from some of those practices. And then the other thing we're watching in Europe is with the Digital Services Act. There are some provisions related to researcher access to social media data, which is, right now in the United States, like one of the most powerful ways that we are able to hold social media companies accountable is from researchers kind of studying the spread of information and how their algorithms work. But obviously it's very sensitive data, right? So how can you share that with researchers while following, they're going to be following GDPR while doing it. And so we've been watching that process really closely. It's very wonky, but we, the Congresswoman thinks it's really, really important, both from a privacy perspective and from the other online safety issues related to social media. So those are just two that we're watching closely.
Thank you. What about if we turn to something that Cade raised? And then I also, when you were saying ceilings and floors, when I was listening to Anna, I was writing down ceilings. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Let me respond. First, it's really, really important to understand that reasonable people can disagree on this. I think it's just, we got to be really civil. It's quite complicated. It's really not industry groups versus consumer groups. There are a lot of consumer groups who do endorse ADAPA as a compromise approach. And I think it's really important to note a couple of things. One, just the political reality of the world we're living in is if we want a private right of action for every individual in this country, and Kate is right, if you have got a strong privacy law in a certain state, it is likely that a lot of companies will meet that. But if the private right of action is only in one state, then consumers outside of that state would not be able to practice that. So there are consumer advocates that want everyone to have a private right of action. And in order to get that, you need 60 senators to agree to that. And that means you're going to need a bipartisan bill in this country, which means you're going to have to probably preempt at least some portions of state laws. And so that's what ADAPA does. It creates sort of this ceiling on certain comprehensive consumer privacy provisions, and preemption does happen on a provision by provision basis. It does leave space for sort of these narrow areas that I pointed out, like student privacy, like health, additional civil rights pieces too. And I think ongoing conversation about what those pieces look like does make a lot of sense. But reasonable people can agree that a private right of action is really, really important. So it's complicated. I just want to point out that there are reasons you might want to make sort of these trade-offs. The future proofing, I think, is a very good point. And a lot of people do think states are a good space to be able to kind of be laboratories of democracy, if you will. You'll hear that a lot. Mm-hmm. I think that's valid. I will also point out that there's two other ways to think about future proofing. One is the role of rulemaking, and there is discussion right now of strengthening some of the language in ADAPA around sort of, do you, have the FTC revisit the rules more frequently or kind of different processes so that you can kind of keep up with that tech. Again, I'm not saying that's a perfect solution, but it's something to think about. And then the other thing I think about with future proofing a lot too is thinking about these oncoming platforms, AR, VR, IoT. Yes, that they are going to be new technologies, but if you speak to a lot of data ethicists, most will admit that it's the same sensitive data, right? It's the same sort of harms. It's the same sort of, if you look at a lot of the definitions coming through ADAPA, coming through a lot of the state laws too, it's a lot of the same types of data. So kind of how do we write these laws, whether we have floors or ceilings, so that we're protecting against those kind of future harms too. But I just want to be really clear that reasonable people can disagree and still care about consumers.
Yeah, no question. I didn't mean to imply that that's not the case. And I know that Congress has done a tremendous amount of really important work on this bill. And it is true that there are a lot of national civil rights groups that are strongly supportive of the compromise. So, mea culpa. I think the issue is that at the state level, a lot of advocates are really frustrated by the preemption provisions because it shuts the door in our face. It makes it impossible for us to continue fighting in our own communities for the protections that we would like to see. And, you're absolutely right about the political realities in Congress, so that I think reasonable people can disagree or agree about what that means, right? Like, I don't know that Mitch McConnell should have a hand in writing privacy law for Massachusetts, right? So yeah, it is a complex issue. The bill is actually quite good. There's a lot to like in the legislation. It's just that, that ceiling preemption is really difficult for us who work on policy issues in the states to accept, because the bill's not perfect, right? And there are things that we would like to be able to do that we would not be able to do even now if the legislation passed with that strong preemption language. So I just want to be clear that the National ACLU's position on this legislation is actually it's very complicated. We wrote like a 30-page letter to Congress laying out all of our feelings about the legislation, not coming out in favor of it or against it. So I just, speaking on behalf of the ACLU, there's a lot to love in this bill. Speaking on behalf of the ACLU of Massachusetts, I will just say the preemption issues really do concern us. So I appreciate all the work you've done on this, and your colleagues too.
And I would add, now I'm not going to make any sort of judgment on ADAPA, just that's not where Education Commission of the States lives. But one thing that is quite important is the ability for the community, for communities in states to engage in the conversations that then can lead to legislation, that can inform legislation. And so one important aspect of a lot of this is where possible not to short circuit some of those kinds of conversations as well. And in fact, there are states, Maryland among others, which have done quite well in creating public engagement mechanisms to ensure also that data privacy laws and policies remain sensitive to changes in technology and in practice and in all sorts of different environmental dynamics that can affect how people perceive the importance of their data and what how they can be empowered to use it and protect those data. So states look to each other to figure out what best practices, but in the best cases, they also look very much to their own communities to make these kinds of decisions. And so there is some degree of obviously they're also looking at FERPA, and looking at other kinds of important federal laws, but they have to do this dance to make sure that everything sort of lines up and they're feeling like they're actually representing their own communities.
No, it's a great point. And I'm mindful as well, just to underscore, Anna, your reflections on also the enforcement mechanisms and the role of the executive branch and the rule maker, and ensuring there's a lot of ability to be dynamic in that space. And, as someone who's been on the executive branch side and worked with state agencies to develop regulations based on statutes and worked on the 2011 FERPA regulation rewrite, right? That is a space that also is a critical sort of when you're thinking about the interplay of the different levers of policy. So I think that's a good one to flag as well. Sarah, were you going to say something? I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that the education space is really interesting for the community engagement, because you're going to get different student data privacy practices at each district and in some places at each school. And a lot of that depends on how, it depends on engaged parents. It depends on the funding for their IT department. It depends on what products they're using in their classroom. It depends on the state laws. It depends on the federal laws. So when you're looking at little laboratories of democracy, you can really look to some of these local school districts to see how they're playing. And it's really hard. There's no easy answers, especially when it comes to protecting student data privacy and the best way to go about doing it, because every single parent, every single teacher really puts their students first, and figuring out how to make a student be able to access their education, be able to have equitable education, that's the priority. And making sure that their privacy is protected is a major component of all of that. So
Right.
figuring out how to chart that path is hard. And I appreciate the work that everyone on this call is doing to play a role in that. And we all make it hard for each other. So that's why these conversations are fun.
Sure. I mean, two themes that come out of that for me and that I've heard earlier tonight as well are around the implementation piece. You know, the law, I mean, getting the law right is so important, but, and I think this is to your point, Klaus, as well, and some of those principles. I mean, how are the actual people who are, you know, impacted by the law going to receive it and internalize it and then act upon it? And are they given the right tools and training and understanding to really then see the law implemented in the way that's envisioned, that it's designed? You know, is the design going to be reflected in implementation? And part of that as well is around enforcement. And so who's empowered to really keep an eye on things, make sure that rights are protected, that consumers are aware of their rights? What kind of agency do they have in themselves to the point of a private right of action, for example? I want to be mindful of our time and just maybe leave a little bit of space for, you know, closing remarks. And if you might focus specifically on people who are going to watch and think, well, I know now I need to be tracking what's happening in Congress. I want to be thinking about what's happening here in Massachusetts or in the other states. Maybe I want to check in with my local school district and ask if anyone's talking about these issues as well. But what maybe closing remarks a little bit as well about the space of how can consumers sort of assert their rights to privacy right now? What are some things we can be doing each day in the same way that we remember to brush our teeth, hopefully, unless we're my 4-year-old, or when we're checking our cell phone, unless you're my dad who doesn't have one. You know, what are some things we can do daily to sort of reinforce what we're all talking about as a real value and an importance to continue to assert this right to privacy? So who could kick us off on that? Anyone want to take? Go ahead.
Yeah, I can start on that. So a couple of things that everyone can do right now. One is you can download Signal on your smartphone, which is a free messaging and communications app. You can do video calls, voice calls, and messages on Signal. It only works if the other person you're communicating with has also downloaded Signal, but it's fully encrypted end to end, which means that, you know, the NSA, your phone company, no one can see what messages you're sending or listen in, except if they have your physical device or the physical device of the person you're communicating with. I basically only use Signal for my family, my work, my friends' communication. I highly recommend it. Another thing people can do is to use DuckDuckGo, which is a privacy preserving search engine. You know, just to be frank, it's not as deluxe as Google, but it works for simple searches. You know, I do turn to Google when I have some more complicated questions I'd like to ask the internet, but it works for a lot of things. Certainly, if you just want to know, like, you know, where a restaurant is or something like that, you can use DuckDuckGo very easily. It does not sell your information. It does not target ads to you based on your, you know, specific, you know, information about where you live or you're, you know, building a profile of you or anything like that in the way that Google does. And then, you know, third, I would just say beyond those two and a couple other issues, like maybe using a virtual private network, a VPN to protect and encrypt your internet traffic, these are really political problems, right? That's what we've been talking about tonight. These are not issues that I think individual people should be expected to solve for themselves or for their families. What we really need is to elect people like those are the elected officials and those representing the elected officials on this call who care about privacy and will fight for your rights in Congress and in the state legislature here in Massachusetts. So what that really means, I mean, you know, another thing, I'll just be rude again and say, you know, that there's a problem in this country, which is that institutions that have a lot of money have too much power and influence, right? I mean, the reason that we can't get 60 votes in DC for a strong consumer privacy law that has a private right of action and does not preempt state governments from passing stronger privacy laws is because lots of members of Congress are swayed by big tech and all of the money that they can pour into lobbying in DC. That's just a fact. So, you know, our problems in this country around democracy impact the technology and privacy space as well, just like they do voting rights and many other things. So get involved, you know, run for office if you're frustrated with your rep, find someone else who's who can run for office. If you're frustrated that your representatives don't seem to care about these issues, if you are lucky enough to be represented by someone like Rep. Lipper-Garabedian or Congresswoman Trahan, support them, go out and do what you can during election season, and certainly vote. Participating in your democracy is honestly the most important thing you can do on this issue and so many others that we all care about.
Thanks, Kate. Anyone else? Klaus?
Yeah, I would say when it comes just to the education data and the data that are being collected on your family members or children or the people for whom you're guardians, is go to the various resources online to figure out what's happening. And it's not always super easy, but you can go to a place like, it's called the Privacy Technical Assistance Center. And that is actually from the US Department of Education. And it gives you an overview of what sorts of questions you should ask, what kinds of data are being collected by your child, and what your rights are. You can also go, this I'm sure is true of Massachusetts, to your state Department of Education website, and you can look at the data tab. And there should be a place there that tells you what data they're actually collecting. What do they have? And then if that raises questions, you might find people you can talk to. In some states like Utah, there's someone actually detailed to this, to take calls from people who might have concerns. So there are ways in which you can find your way into this. And if the state is transparent enough, where you can begin to figure out what kinds of information are people collecting for my child, and you can follow up. So there are pathways for that and resources.
Thank you. Go ahead, Sarah.
I had the U.S. Department of Education's Privacy Technical Assistance Center on my list of recommendations as well. So a second vote for that, a +1, an upvote. I also, if you're a parent or a guardian or have a small child or even a slightly larger child in your world, there's a lot of information coming at you. And I think that one of the things that I try to do, not only for my world, but how I interact with the world, is decide what I'm comfortable with that at that day, during that day. And like, if I want to share a photo, if I want to do something, I want to feel comfortable doing it. But if I decide to reassess and change my mind on what I'm comfortable with later, I allow myself to do that. So I think that allowing yourself to change your mind on what you feel comfortable doing online, and allowing yourself to learn and allowing yourself to be interested in what's happening is what I recommend. And you don't have to do everything. The internet tells you to do all sorts of crazy stuff. So just do it, figure out what you're comfortable with and go forth.
Okay. Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah.
Anna?
And I'll just close with, great tips, but yeah, at the end of the day, we have too many companies in this country who have been unregulated and have been invading people's data rights. And it should not be on parents. It should not be on consumers to have to read endless terms of service. This is, to have to go find the right app and download it, all of those things. Really, lawmakers, regulators, we have to put some guardrails here. And so at the state level, at the local level, at the federal level, our allies and partners around the globe, right? Everyone needs to do it. And, the internet doesn't have strict borders, right? So some of this will filter through. And we've already seen that, right? Like ADAPA is as strong as it is because California was strong, right? And so I am by all means not coming here to say, don't do great work. Massachusetts, great reps, they're doing great work. And yeah, we got to do it at all levels. So it was great to be here, and let's keep fighting for this.
It's been great. I really have appreciated all of you being with us tonight to just talk through each of your perspectives, what you're working on, thinking about how complicated this dynamic is. I hope that I'm correctly sharing my screen right now just to give our contact information up there. I see a nod, so that's great. So here's ways in which you can contact each of the panelists with follow-up questions, of course, ways to contact me also. I am committed to continuing to learn in this space. I feel really strongly about the Student and Educator Data Privacy Act that I filed this session, and plan to continue to press really hard for Massachusetts to catch up to many of the states and to learn from them. As I mentioned before, and as I think someone said, there's no best law in this space. A lot of states have done different things, and part of what has been, you know, an advantage to being behind is that I've been able to say, that state included pre-K data. Oh, and this state has more information for parents needs to be posted. So there's a lot there that we can learn from each other, and also, you know, really grateful for the attention that's happening at the national, at the federal level. I do agree that that's critical, and that in the same way that states are, you know, working hard to work with our local communities and learn from them, I think states and people like me and others would be glad to step forward and support efforts. And I think you've seen that, you know, with Congresswoman Trahan and Senator Markey. I'm happy to support the work that you all are doing to make sure that we are pressing as hard as possible to have our legal framework really reflect the world in which we are living, and that we will, you know, will continue to live in, privacy being such an important value in our democracy. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. As I said in the chat, we will be sharing this recording out. Please stay tuned for upcoming community conversations. I'm grateful again for our panels tonight. So thanks everyone, and please be well.